Picture a medieval knight. Close your eyes and you can almost see him. Silver armor gleaming under the sun, a snow-white warhorse pawing the ground, a noble warrior swearing a sacred vow to protect the innocent, defend the weak, and serve his fair maiden. It is a beautiful picture. It is a legendary story, and it is a 100% fabricated lie. It is a lie invented by poets and writers hundreds of years after the last real knight had rotted in the ground. If you want to understand the Middle Ages, you have to forget Hollywood. You have to forget the fairy tales. You have to look at a knight not through the eyes of a romantic poet, but through the eyes of a medieval peasant. To them, a knight was not a hero. He was an investment, a weapon, the medieval equivalent of a modern main battle tank, operated by a heavily armed racketeer. And this is where the myth completely breaks. Chivalry did not begin with morality. It began with cold, hard economics. Becoming a knight was astronomically expensive. A full-blooded warhorse, the destrier, along with custom-fitted chainmail, plate armor, swords, lances, and the cost of keeping a retinue of squires and servants was not cheap. It cost the equivalent of millions of dollars today. It cost as much as an entire village could produce in several years of back-breaking labor. A lord did not make this massive financial investment so a man could ride around doing good deeds. A knight was a professional enforcer. His sole purpose was to exercise a monopoly on violence for the man who paid his bills. But what about the glorious chivalric code of honor? It existed, but it was a private club. These were the rules of the game designed exclusively for the 1%. The code dictated how noblemen should fight, capture, and treat other noblemen. Why? Because a captured duke or a rival knight was worth a fortune in ransom money. You didn't kill a wealthy hostage, you traded them. But this code had absolutely nothing to do with the common people. The most common tactic of medieval warfare was not a heroic army versus army clash on an open field. It was the chevauchée, the scorched earth raid. Knights would storm into enemy territory and completely bypass the enemy army. Instead, they burned crops. They slaughtered livestock. They destroyed mills. They wiped out unarmed peasant villages to economically bankrupt their rival lord. For 90% of the population of Europe, an armored knight was not a savior. He was the most terrifying, ruthless monster one could possibly encounter. This was not honor, this was economics. But the worst part wasn't the battle, it was the armor. Erase the image of perfectly clean, polished metal from your mind. The reality of wearing medieval armor was a claustrophobic nightmare. First, the metal rusted. It rusted from rain. It rusted from the damp air. It rusted from the sweat pouring off the man inside it. And beneath that heavy metal was the gambeson, a thick, heavy, quilted jacket. This jacket absorbed all your sweat like a sponge. In the middle of a military campaign, it never fully dried. It became stiff with salt, dirt, and blood. It was a perfect, warm breeding ground for lice, fleas, and skin infections. You wore this for weeks at a time. Then the helmet goes on. The heavy visor drops. Suddenly, your entire world vanishes. Your field of vision narrows down to a tiny, suffocating horizontal slit. You lose all peripheral vision. You cannot see what is beside you. You can barely see what is right in front of you. Airflow is completely restricted. Under the scorching summer sun, a steel helmet turns into a metal oven. Every breath you take is a mixture of hot, stale air, the dust kicked up by horses, and the overwhelming stench of your own unwashed body. And then the fighting starts. Movies love to show elegant sword fighting, brilliant parries, sparks flying from crossing blades. Real knightly combat? It was an exhausting, brutal wrestling match in the mud. You cannot easily hack through quality steel plate armor with a sword. The battlefield quickly degraded into a slippery, chaotic mess. Heavy, armored men slammed into each other. desperately trying to knock their opponent off their feet. This was not a duel. It was a desperate struggle to breathe. Your heart rate spikes, your lungs burn, your arms feel like lead after swinging a heavy weapon for just 3 minutes. You finally knock the enemy down. The mud is slick with rain and blood. You drop your entire body weight onto him, pinning him to the ground. You reach for your dagger. They called it the Misericord, the dagger of mercy. You do not swing a sword. You grapple. You look the man in the eyes through the narrow slit of his visor. You feel his panicked, hot breath. You find the gap in the armor, under the armpit, at the neck, or the joints of the groin, and you finish him at close range. It is not elegant. It is not noble. It is physical, exhausting, and deeply personal. It is a meat grinder. This was not a game. This was pure survival. So, how did these men sleep at night? How did they justify the brutal reality of their profession? They slept perfectly fine. Their psychology was entirely adapted to a world of extreme violence. And more importantly, this violence was sanctified by the society they lived in. They felt no guilt. They genuinely believed in their divine right to rule. The logic was brutally simple. If you were born with a sword in your hand and another man was born with a plow in his hand, that was the natural order of the universe. You had the absolute right to take what you wanted from those who were too weak to defend it. But what about the romances? What about courtly love, the fair maiden, and the grand tournaments? This is perhaps the biggest illusion of all. Courtly love was a literary facade. It was an entertaining story told at feasts, carefully designed to hide the absolute, crushing disenfranchisement of women in the Middle Ages. In the real world of chivalry, noble women were not queens of romance. They were political currency. They were traded. They were sold into marriages as teenagers or even children to secure a border, finalize a military alliance, or acquire new, fertile lands. A knight might tie a lady's favor to his lance at a public tournament to show off for the crowd. But behind closed castle doors, he was an absolute dictator. The law and the church gave him total control over his household, his lands, and his wife. Obedience was not a request. It was an absolute requirement, enforced by whatever means necessary. Even the famous tournaments, the jousting and the grand pageants were mostly a massive, high-stakes business. Knights traveled the tournament circuit not just for glory, but to capture rivals in mock combat, take their expensive horses, and force them to pay heavy ransoms. It was a medieval sports league driven by gambling and extortion. Medieval chivalry was an era of unparalleled, breathtaking hypocrisy. Behind the bright coats of arms, the soaring stone castles, and the lofty words about honor hid a ruthless system of harsh class domination. So why do we believe the myth today? Because the knights won. Because the lords and the kings had all the money, and they used that money to pay the chroniclers, the poets, and the troubadours to write the history books. They bought their own public relations. They paid men to write songs about how brave and noble they were, while the peasants they stepped on could not read or write a single word to argue back. But if you strip away the poetry, if you peel back the gold leaf and listen to the real echo of the centuries, you will not hear the sweet songs of troubadours. You will hear the heavy, exhausted breathing inside a rusted helmet. You will hear the clash of iron in the mud, and you will hear the crackle of burning roofs in the distance. This was not chivalry. This was power.